Good evening, everybody. I would like to welcome you to the webinar at the York Festival of Ideas entitled How Male Privilege Hurts Women. And we're going to talk tonight with Kate Manne, who will be our guest. Just to say that this event is supported by University of York Athena Swan funding. The university holds an institutional bronze Athena Swan Award and 23 departmental awards. The Athena Swan Charter recognizes the advancement of gender equality, representation, progression, and success for all. A couple of technical notes before we introduce our speaker tonight. If you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. This is available throughout the event, so questions can be asked at any time. Should you have technical issues such as loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch again. Subtitles are available in this event. To turn these on or off, use the CC Live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. Now, I would like to introduce Kate Manne to you. She is an associate professor of philosophy at Cornell University, United States, where she has taught since 2013. She did her graduate work at MIT and was a junior fellow in the Harvard Society of Fellows. She's the author of Down Girl. She has written for the New York Times, Boston Review, Huffington Post, the Time Literary Supplement, and Politico, among other publications. She was recently named one of the world's top 10 thinkers by Prospect UK. So please let me welcome Kate Manne. And
thank you. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks to everyone for being here.
Yeah. So Kate, I've really thoroughly enjoyed reading your book, and there are some very interesting concepts that you propose that I haven't thought of in such a way. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit further to the audience and talk about the distinction between two concepts that you mentioned that often get used interchangeably but are very different: the concept of misogyny and the concept of sexism.
Sure. Thanks, Carla. So I think of misogyny as effectively the law enforcement branch of patriarchy. I think of it as the hostility and hatred women face that serves a particular social function. It functions to enforce and police patriarchal norms and expectations. Whereas sexism, I think of as, if you like, the bad science of patriarchy. Sexism is the kind of ideology, the set of beliefs and cultural narratives that say that men are naturally better suited to masculine-coded positions and positions of authority in society, and women are naturally suited to feminine-coded positions like caregiving. So in a slogan, misogyny is kind of going on witch hunts. It's the active, dynamic wing of patriarchy. And sexism wears a lab coat. It kind of theorizes why we should have a patriarchal order, contrary to, I think, our best scientific evidence.
Okay, and could you nicely, after explaining that, go to talk about how this act of misogyny might be related to the concept of male entitlement being at the core of many things that we see might hurt women. Could you explain that connection between entitlement and misogyny a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So ever since I wrote my first book, Down Girl, which proposed this concept of misogyny as opposed to a more naive definition of misogyny that holds misogyny as some kind of psychological property of hate-filled men, I've been thinking about, well, what are the patriarchal norms and expectations that misogyny serves to police and enforce? Because obviously on my definition of misogyny, that's central. And I'm particularly interested in at least superficially more egalitarian milieu, like the UK, like the US, like my native country of Australia. What are these patriarchal norms and expectations, if any? And my answer to that is contained in this second book entitled I hold that it's largely a matter of a system of entitlements where men are deemed entitled to or deserving of certain goods from women. Things like sex, most obviously, but still more insidiously, things like care, love, attention, affection, admiration, power, support, also claims to knowledge. And by the same token, women are deemed obligated to give those goods to privileged men in their vicinity under many forms of patriarchal social relations, including things like marriage, parent-child relations, as well as relations in the workplace and in civic discourse generally. So that's how I think of these entitlements that misogyny serves to police and enforce. And one of the upshots of that is that women are often punished for not giving men what they're deemed entitled to.
And you think this entitlement is something that our patriarchal society is allows or teaches men to have those entitlements? Is that kind of the crux
Yes,
of it? Yeah.
I think that's right. In fact, I think it teaches us all that men are more entitled, especially in as much as they're privileged along racial and class lines, and also in virtue of being cis rather than trans, virtue of being non-disabled. I think it teaches us all that privileged men have these kinds of entitlements, and that women, particularly more vulnerable women in being women of color or trans women or both, are not entitled to certain basic goods, even if they're genuinely entitled to them in fact. So I think it's actually an expectation that isn't just absorbed by men, but is something which we're all inculcated into, whether we're a man, a woman, non-binary. I think it's a general social expectation that men will get to reap these benefits, again, especially in as much as they're privileged.
So can you elaborate a little bit more how this framework of male entitlement might limit women's freedom in many different domains, let it be sex, knowledge, power, domestic labor, or medical care, or body control? Could you give us a couple of examples, what you...
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there's a question in each of those that I think is worth kind of elaborating on, so we can spend some time there. So one domain in which male privilege is obviously operative is sex. And I've been interested in my research in ways in which men who commit acts of sexual violence, sexual assault, and sexual harassment are often the beneficiaries of what I call himpathy, which is what I define that as, so it's a tongue-in-cheek term for the kind of disproportionate or undue sympathy often given to privileged male perpetrators over their female victims in these cases of misogynistic behavior. So we see this in cases like notoriously in the United States, the Brock Turner case, where he was caught in the act of sexually assaulting a young woman after a party at Stanford. There was no real doubt about his guilt. He'd been apprehended by two Swedish graduate students who had called the police and told them what they saw him doing, to the woman Chanel Miller, who's now written a brilliant memoir, Know My Name, about her assault. But as she movingly recounts, the public reaction as well as the judge's reaction was full of undue sympathy, as well as just sheer admiration for Brock Turner as a kind of lionized swimmer and athlete and Stanford scholarship recipient. There was a sense that his bright future had been tarnished by her having brought charges against him for this sexual assault, rather than that he was responsible for not only this terrible crime against her, but also for the loss of his supposedly bright future, because he was the one who acted in such an heinous manner in perpetrating against her and thus deserved to not retain his swimming scholarship, for example. Whatever else you think sexual assault perpetrators, whatever you think would be the just response to them, losing one's swimming scholarship isn't the grounds for endless sympathy, I think it's fair to say, in any just world. So that's kind of one example in which men's entitlement, perceived entitlement to sexual misogyny runs amok in our society via rape culture, where we don't hold men sufficiently accountable for their acts of sexual violence. And in fact, we sympathize with them when they're apprehended. So that's particularly true, of course, of white men, especially in as much as they are committing these acts against vulnerable women, women of color, such as Chanel Miller, who is Chinese American.
Often in society also, we're more worried about what happens to the reputation of one person than what is happening to the victim and the victimhood. There is, in the United Kingdom, there was a documentary that documented a police treatment of rape victims and victim blaming, right? And that is definitely something that we're not really far off from, right? But often when we think about male entitlement, we also think mostly in relation to sex. And I was wondering, how do you see this male entitlement playing in the idea of knowledge, women in knowledge, and or women's power in it?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's, I'm really glad you brought that up because I think it's worth talking about male entitlement in multiple domains, and those include the domestic realm, they include medical care, include bodily control, and yes, power and claims to knowledge is also a big part of it. So when it comes to knowledge, I think one obvious and often unwittingly funny manifestation of male privilege and male entitlement takes the form of mansplaining, where a man who is at least paradigmatically less knowledgeable than his female interlocutor holds forth on a subject out of a sense that he is entitled to be positioned socially as the knower, as the authority figure, as the giver of information, rather than as someone who listens and learns. And so that can result in situations where there is this ironic, as Nicole Dullar puts it in her article, an inversion of epistemic roles, where even though he should be the listener, he acts as if he is the rightful authority on a subject about which he knows little to nothing in comparison with a more expert female interlocutor. So that's one manifestation of entitlement in the domain of knowledge. I think another darker and in some ways more subtle one is gaslighting. So I think a gaslighter is someone who often proceeds out of a sense that he is entitled to control the narrative and to epistemically dominate another person who, again, in this situation, it's important to see that this isn't an exclusively gendered phenomenon, but it is, I think, illuminated by thinking about gendered dynamics. So in, again, the paradigm case introduced to us by the play Gaslight, or also known as Angel Street, we had a husband who so thoroughly felt entitled to epistemically dominate his wife, Bella, that he paints her to her as defective, as morally or rationally messed up, in as much as she challenges his version of events, his version of reality, his side of the story. So much so that she can't even assert the most basic empirical realities, like the fact that the gas lights are flickering, which means in the play that he must have been turning on the light in another part of the house when he alleges to be out at night. So he's actually creeping about in the attic looking for his wife's aunt's jewels. So the way the play unfolds shows that this sense of extreme epistemic entitlement can function to make someone paint the other as rationally and morally defective in as much as they would challenge his version of events.
There's an interesting, from our audience, an observation which I'm going to read, which I think follows nicely into the next question I wanted to talk about, entitlement and family. Our attendee says, I see male entitlement to women's time and emotional labor on woman-centered forums. There is often an expectation that women owe them an explanation or a justification of feminism. And if they don't get it, they feel genuinely aggravated. It's like, if you talk about this, you're against them, right? In a sense, you need to justify that.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant observation. This sense of entitlement to receive explanations can also be part of epistemic entitlement. So feeling like in cases where you don't consider yourself expert, thinking that you are owed or due a kind of full, thorough explanation or education about matters under discussion, when that might totally derail the conversation. I think that's also a good example of a tendency among people who are the beneficiaries of these forms of entitlement to center themselves in discussions that should really be revolving around the interests and ideas and thoughts of people who are more marginalized, of people who are, after all, the subject of the discussion when it comes to feminism, namely girls and women, as well as non-binary folks. So that observation really resonates with me.
And I guess when we talk about entitlement, we usually think somebody who is not our close person, but you're outlining that that's not true, that this sense of society of entitlement also creeps into our homes. And that is very evident in what's happened with COVID, right? With this situation when we were all locked up in our homes, and what happens to domestic labor and relationship of entitlement and women. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one thing that it's crucial to observe here is that despite a kind of myth of more modern involved fathers, the second shift problem hasn't budged in 20 years in the US and the UK. So that to define the term for those of you who haven't heard it before, the second shift problem was a term coined by Ali Russell Hochschild, a Berkeley sociologist, to get at the idea that women effectively work a second shift when they're in heterosexual partnerships and have children, especially. So when working women get home, they have another shift of child rearing and domestic obligations that are largely not fully shared by male partners on average. So we see, in terms of time use diaries done by sociologists and social psychologists, that women do twice as much domestic and child rearing labor as their husbands if they're in a heterosexual partnership and the woman works full time, as does the man. There's actually only one situation in which men begin to approach parity in terms of domestic and child-rearing labor with female partners, which is when she works full-time and he is unemployed. Then he'll begin to approach parity. She will still do a bit more. And some studies are even more pessimistic, in fact, and show that if she earns more than he does, she will tend to compensate for a perceived possibility of emasculating a male partner by doing yet more labor around the house. So this is a very inequitable situation that the pandemic has merely exacerbated. So obviously huge burdens have been placed on families during lockdown in terms of both schooling children, childcare, and forms of domestic labor that are always ongoing, but even more so during pandemic, things like meal prep and keeping track of all of the members of a household's needs. So there's also the mental and emotional load that women carry. And what we've seen is that women are the ones dropping out of the workplace presumably because they are so overburdened with this kind of labor. And what we see is that men's sense of entitlement is directly linked to this. Men have often felt entitled in these contexts to more leisure time and sleep than their female partners, even though it's obvious that those are things that should be equitably distributed too, that everyone deserves sleep and leisure time in as much as it's available. So this is something the pandemic has exacerbated and crystallized and brought out, but it's a very old problem. And I think one we need to be highly aware of going forward, that men's lack of participation at home, their sense of entitlement to be not only at leisure more, but also catered to, means that in some circumstances, anecdotally, women find that they have more time and leisure when they are single parents, when they get divorced. They're no longer looking after a husband as well as children, and also if there's a something close to a 50-50 custody split, he has to do almost as much. So there you go.
That's interesting. We talk about only kind of distinction in a cisgender men and women. However, there's a question from the audience asking if entitlement is split solely along gender lines, or is there other ways?
Well, there's certainly huge aspects to it in terms of, I think, all intersecting systems of oppression. So I absolutely think there's such a thing as, a sense of entitlement that comes along with being cis. And in particular, there are elements of transphobia that are really deeply connected with entitlement, namely a sense of entitlement to be able to read someone's reproductive capacities and genital arrangements off their social appearance. Even though I think it's clear that in moral reality, no one has such an entitlement, that people's capacities and genital arrangements are as paradigmatic of their own business as anything could be, and are clearly a matter that shouldn't be publicly interrogated in these ways. So I think this sense of entitlement, this transphobic sense of entitlement, to be able to know what someone is at a glance, is a particularly pernicious form of cis privilege. Another element of this course are the ways these forms of privilege and entitlement intersect with racial privilege, which is a huge ongoing systemic issue that I can barely touch the surface of. But yeah, I'm most interested in a way in my work in white, cis, non-disabled men's sense of entitlement to dominate both women, people of color, the disabled, and trans folks in ways that are incredibly harmful and pernicious to a majority of people in society.
So as a mother of 2 young boys, and I'm sure many parents that do have boys, one would ask, looking at the different things that you've kind of identified as male entitlement, how should one raise a young boy, thinking about, how do you raise them in a society that they would not feel the entitlement or not require it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and one that in a way I have been curious to learn more about from other parents. As the parent of a daughter, a young girl, I haven't had to think through this in ways that are quite as concrete as many of my counterparts who are raising boys. And I think it's a delicate balance because, of course, you don't want to, depict a young boy as anything other than what he is, namely, an innocent young boy, or, give him a sense of himself as a potential villain. That's obviously not what any parent wants to do. But at the same time, making boys aware that their slightly older male counterparts are often acting entitled to women's labor in ways that are wrong seems to me important. I mean, one of the best things I think one could do within a heterosexual household is have men fully participate in caregiving labor to model that for young boys, that care work is not beneath boys, that it's actually important and meaningful, as well as, of course, educating boys about the importance of things like bodily autonomy and sexual consent and recognizing gender diversity and the importance of respecting people's gender identity. And some of this is stuff that is common to raising boys, girls, and also non-binary kids. Some of it, I think, is usefully made more pointed when it comes to boys. But yeah, I mean, if I was, you know, able to have any influence on educational policy, which is, you know, of course, a bit of a pipe dream, I would be very much in favor of thinking about teaching young people about not just consent when it comes to sex, but also what exactly does domestic violence look like? What does emotional abuse look like? What would be an antidote to those forms of those dynamics in terms of what is the antidote to gaslighting? How can you recognize that you're being gaslit or dominated in other ways and guiltlessly extract yourself from the situation? Those are forms of education that are, I think, a bit more sweeping than is what is typically done, and I think would be quite beneficial, whether it was via parents or in the school system. It's also important to recognize, I should say, that you know, one of the figures that troubled me the most when I was writing this book is that in the US, at least, between a third and a quarter of sexual assault is committed by juvenile offenders who are overwhelmingly male, just as with older perpetrators. So we really have to start these lessons quite early, because what we find, somewhat shockingly, is that a lot of sexual assault is committed by boys, not men.
Yeah, we struggle with that. There's some research at our university that is looking at the idea of lad culture, right? That also continues also at university level, where there's an expectation that women should, that men, you know, this is a place where women should have more freedom and thus give to whoever feels entitled. I guess there is a little bit of a controversial question that I guess is important to address, and that is to what extent you've mentioned that you are concentrated on the idea of white male entitlement. However, is there such a thing as female entitlement? Are there areas where there is female entitlement, or is that worth at all pursuing?
I don't think so, especially. I mean, I think we can distinguish two questions. Is there a specifically feminine form of entitlement? You know, I'd have to hear examples, but I've yet to hear very convincing ones. People tend to say things like women feeling entitled to have the door held open for them, or be given a seat on the subway. If one felt entitled to either of those things as a woman, one would be bitterly disappointed at every turn. I don't know many women who have that sense of entitlement. I think, though, women can certainly be overly entitled in virtue of other dimensions of privilege. So, for example, think about an Amy Cooper in Central Park, who, to remind you, was the woman in New York in the US who basically called the cops on Christian Cooper, no relation, who was a bird watcher innocently minding his own business in Central Park. And he was Black, she was white, and she evinced a potent form of racial privilege to have this form of paradigmatically male authority, namely the police, deployed on her side with, you know, potentially deadly results for Christian Cooper. So her manifestations of white privilege, I think, were very real. I'm a bit more skeptical that it was specifically female privilege. But yeah, there's no doubt women can exhibit cis privilege, white privilege, non-disabled privilege, and so on and so forth.
So the concept is entitlement is given to the people that have taken it in society, whether in this case you talk about male because they do have it in our society, but it can be taken of feel entitlement based on your race or the how big your group is comparison to a smaller group. So it's not directly along gender lines, and in this you're just giving examples of how it is when it comes to a group which is in our societies the strongest, which is a white male at this point. So
it's complicated, actually. I mean, I think there are forms of privilege along every oppressive axis. I think, though, gender privilege does have certain somewhat unique elements, although at every turn we have to recognize the ways that all forms of privilege intersect. But I would say that gender privilege, as it intersects with racial privilege, particularly expects care. And particularly expects to be ministered to and catered to and have feelings looked after. So I'd say that white male privilege, as it's manifest in at least my milieu, is often a matter of feeling like there is an entitlement to have, to be cared for, admired, given affection, admiration, and that can manifest from things as violent and insidious as incels, these men who, out of a sense of entitlement to, hot women, are violent towards the women who they feel are not giving them their due. And it can also manifest in things as everyday and in some ways subtle as a husband's sense of entitlement to his wife's domestic labor. So I think, yeah, even though there are all these different forms of privilege that need to be recognized, they can have certain somewhat distinctive elements that particularly play out with respect to white men's feelings of entitlement, especially with respect to vulnerable women who are cast into caregiving roles that they don't necessarily sign up for and shouldn't be expected to play automatically, and at the same time are often deprived of their due in terms of care that they deserve, such as medical care, which is another question that you asked earlier that we could touch on now.
Yeah. So more on a personal note, and that's relating to how does this make you feel? Doing this, trying to rationalize and kind of logically explain this. Does this make you feel angry to delve deep into this, or has this affected your own resilience on how do you approach dealing with men entitlement, or is it empowered you or made you angry? I'm just wondering, writing this book and look.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate that question. I mean, I think more than anything, at times it's made me very depressed, very sad, very helpless feeling. Especially when I was writing my first book, I really felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what girls and women face, stuff that we often don't think hard about, especially for women like me who are in a relatively privileged position. Yeah, it can be hard to face some of these things. And in some ways, yeah, I think that's a particular responsibility of privileged women to delve into these things. I would say, though, that it's also been liberating in certain ways. I remember writing my first New York Times piece, and it was on white male cops and how they felt a sense of entitlement to dominate and subjugate other people, such that wishy-washy talk about the humanity of Black folks would do nothing, I thought, to persuade white police officers in these positions of illicit authority to treat other people better, because from my perspective, it seemed perfectly clear that these violent white cops knew that Michael Brown, say in Ferguson, was human. his humanity was precisely the problem, in as much as he had evinced a slight sense of swagger because he was a teenage boy who just graduated high school and was feeling good and, you know, was kind of throwing his weight around a little bit. And that was grounds for someone like Darren Wilson, the police officer, gunning down this boy in his prime, this Black boy. So I think, you know, when I wrote this piece, I, of course, didn't expect it to be uncontroversial, but within 5 minutes of it being tweeted out, you know, I had someone saying on Twitter, dumb C writing dumb things. And, you know, many more abusive and sometimes threatening messages followed. And knowing that as a woman who is speaking out against various forms of oppression, including misogyny, that that's what you're liable to face, I think really takes the sting out of it. I think it can help one to distinguish as a woman writing in public spaces between good, important criticism that we should take seriously and view as useful feedback, even if it's very critical, versus just abusive rubbish that is just something you would expect at this point in human history. And so dampening some of the effects of that and not letting it, you know, be thoroughly eviscerating emotionally, I think that for me has been a useful effect of this work. It helps me see that some of these kinds of abusive and threatening behaviors are part of the misogynistic course for any woman who is somewhat outspoken, which is what I would like to be.
So I wanted to kind of expand a little bit on this idea of entitlement and medical care, just to kind of give you my perspective. We were trying to look at, you know, when we talk about medical care for women, it's mostly concentrated on childbirth. There is rarely a mention of menopause or any other specific things that are related to women's health, right? All the concentration is on kind of men's health. And this is a more subtle way of how I feel, you know, male entitlement at work. So what do you think of that? Do you think it's evident there too?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's important to be careful here because in the US, at least, maternal mortality for Black women and Indigenous women is such a huge issue. So Black women face 3 to 4 times the maternal mortality of white women, which is just a disgraceful, tragic, shocking statistic that urgently requires political and structural action. So I do think there are grounds for talking about this, you know, especially since we see infuriating lack of research and funding going to certain issues that are kind of distinctively feminine coded, such as, maternal health. For an example that came up in Carolyn Criado Perez's wonderful book, Invisible Women, they found that, so one thing we know about emergency C-sections is that they cost an enormous amount of suffering and lives for women around the world, and that the cause of them typically is uterine failure. And it was found in one study that uterine failure was linked to, I'm going to put this in the most flat-footed layman's terms, acid in blood, and you could address this problem with baking soda. So they found they could vastly reduce the number of uterine failure-induced C-sections that are very traumatic and, you know, can even result in severe negative health outcomes and death for women again around the world. They could reduce this outcome by giving people baking soda, pregnant people. And this study was kind of revolutionary and yet was not approved for further funding and research. One suspects partly because there was no money in it, you know, it's just baking soda, it's not a drug, but also because women's health outcomes, especially poorer women who are the ones most likely to suffer from negative outcomes if they have an emergency C-section, globally are not taken seriously. So that's all to say we should be really worried about maternal health. But of course, that's not to say that we're sufficiently worried about all the other forms of either distinctively or paradigmatically female health problems that are incredibly neglected, poorly understood, thought of on a male paradigm. So we know that for women, both cis and trans, heart attacks have different presentations than in cis men. And yet our understanding of what a heart attack looks like, how to treat it, is derived from a male model. Combine that with the fact that women's testimony about their own bodily symptoms and pain is frequently dismissed as either hysterical or even lying, malingering. That adds up to a situation where women, especially again, poor women, women of color, and trans women, are massively marginalized within the medical system at large. So yeah, I think there needs to be a huge amount of attention to ways in which women are being deprived of what they're genuinely due in terms of medical care, as are girls for that matter, who are more, they tend to be prescribed weaker painkillers for the same operations as boys who are their counterparts, which is pretty shocking.
Yeah. Is there any platform in which women have regained their kind of found balance in this entitlement game, or is this we're reaching parity at any point?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are always going to be local spaces of amazing feminist solidarity and sustenance. And so I certainly don't think that these results kind of apply across the board. There can be genuinely egalitarian and progressive institutions of a local kind. I would love it if there were more examples of a broader kind, but I'm skeptical just because I think often these dynamics tend to reproduce and proliferate in institutions that have a kind of greater social purchase. So I think if you look at a girl or woman's life on the whole, and you asked, well, can we think about the medical domain and the household domain and dating and sex and power and claims to knowledge, and think about all of these domains, as well as of course things like money and political representation, is that going to add up to something that's equitable in terms of her life as compared with a male counterpart? I think in general, no, unfortunately. So we still have a lot of feminist work to do in these spaces.
So let's move a little bit more into this intersection of race and gender. We have an attendee that asks, I'd love to hear your perspective in terms of how non-white cis men can aggressively cling to sexism for proximity to privilege, and how within those communities we may best address that. So is that different?
I think that's a great question. I think we always are going to have these problems of people who have some proximity to privilege but don't quite instantiate it, having very powerful incentives to both show loyalty to the most privileged people and to claim whatever vestiges of that privilege they're able to. So I think we see a very similar problem with white women. And I should say I identify as a white woman, albeit also a Jewish woman, who has a special responsibility for these kinds of problems among people of my genre. To kind of think about it on that level, white women are frequently attracted to white male power and show loyalty to white men in power because that's how you gain a smattering of power yourself, by making yourself acceptable to the most powerful and privileged people. And I think that may be true too of other groups, although I'm, necessarily more cautious of generalizing from my own epistemic standpoint here. So I think that may be true in the communities that the questioner is alluding to, in which case, yeah, we have to come up somehow with structural solutions that either disincentivize or educate people about the problems of clinging to these sources of illicit power rather than challenging them as someone who's marginalized but not maximally so. That introduces a kind of powerful moral dilemma that many people, such as white women, many of us unfortunately fall on the wrong side of that dilemma morally.
Does, to relate again to other groups, do you think that misogyny and sexism is also related to homophobia? Do you think this
Yes.
has a
Yeah,
link?
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I've talked about transphobia already, but homophobia is, of course, a distinctive problem deserving a sui generis treatment. And one of the crucial elements of patriarchy that underpins all of these dynamics is thinking that people have to be exclusively and exhaustively male or female and find opposite sex attraction. So as a female finding a male attractive and as a male finding a female attractive, that is the kind of patriarchal, gender binarist, heteronormative order that these norms and ideals impose on us all. And any challenge to that from people who are genderqueer or trans or gay or bisexual, all of those challenges are important ones to the kind of traditional heteronormative cis-sexist patriarchy. And that's very much why I think it's a fight that we're all in together in terms of challenging these pernicious and intersecting oppressive systems.
So let's say as a woman, you kind of have a good idea what to do, but as a man belonging to this group, how does a man go about and change their male privilege to reduce this gender inequality? I mean, what is the approach, obviously?
Yeah.
You think?
So I think that less so as a matter of giving up privilege, which I think is often hard to do. Something that I think hopefully has been emerging from this conversation is these privileges are by and large not up to individuals. They're not something that to a very great extent individuals can renounce and just completely shrug off. That being said, what people who are privileged along these dimensions can do is act as allies or perhaps better accomplices to people who are more marginalized in these ways. And for example, really amplify the voices of feminists and people of color and trans writers and queer writers and people who are trying to speak out about issues that are ways in which cis men can get on board with and broadcast or signal boost for. That together with there are certain kinds of privileges which you might have but not take advantage of. So as a cis man, really getting serious about equity both in the workplace and in civic discourse and at home is, I think, a powerful part of being a feminist accomplice.
Okay, so turning to women and their view of that, there is an interesting question that asks, why do you think women vote for politicians like Trump in the US or Berlusconi in Italy, but outwardly not only sexist but also misogynistic views? So what happens? Where is the
Totally.
discord? How does entitlement explain something like that?
I mean, I think a crucial part of it is that leaders like Trump and Berlusconi are the kind of men who are deemed entitled to female loyalty, love, affection, and admiration. I mean, they both embody a kind of contemporary misogyny that doesn't shun women. It invites women in and actually allows them to be quite powerful in as much as they're loyal, deferential, and basically subservient. So think of the kind of women who Trump attracted to his administration, from a Hope Hicks to a Kellyanne Conway, to a Sarah Huckabee Sanders. These are women who were able to get quite a lot of power and responsibility by being completely deferential to Trump. It was only when these women kind of challenged or crossed him that they would be subject to Trump's undoubted misogyny. So I think that's one answer, that we kind of, as white women in particular, and in fact almost exclusively, if you look at the numbers, are in the habit of paying homage to powerful and misogynistic men who grant them a little bit of power, either in reality or kind of in spirit, in as much as we're deferential to these men. The other part of the answer is these women's husbands. So women are also often fall in voting line with their husbands. And what we saw in the US, at least, I'm not sure about the patterns in Italy, but what we saw was men flocked to Trump within the Republican Party, and then white women followed. And I think this fact that white women's agency is often expressed in backing up their husband's moral and political judgments is something that really demands careful, close attention, reflection, and circumspection.
Okay. Kind of related to that, there was interesting questions. It said it is a cause of great resentment among many married women that I know that their husband expects still to have the same amount of free time for hobbies after they've had children, I guess also in that sense. Does that come as part of the entitlement too? The relationship we have with
Oh, yes. It certainly does. I read this amazing book, amazing in a bad way, called How Not to Hate Your Husband After Kids by Jancy Dunn, when I was writing this book. And I mean, I'm not really, well, I guess I am criticizing Dunn, but I'm more so criticizing her husband, who expected to go on leisurely trips to Italy and long bike rides and just sit around and go out to brunch and have drinks with friends without consulting her after they had a child. And so, she estimated about 90% of the child rearing and domestic labor, despite the fact that they had comparable full-time writing careers as freelance journalists. I mean, it was just clear, even from, and this is just an example, of course, but I think it applies much more broadly. It was clear that her husband, Tom, evinced a complete sense of entitlement to these perks and privileges, so much so that they went to a very famous Boston therapist, Terry Real, to get kind of diagnosed as to what was going wrong in their relationship. And he just said that Tom was massively entitled to, lots of sleep, leisure, games, friendship time, all the stuff that does inevitably fall by the wayside when you have very young children. And so, I would like to see a husband think of writing a book, how not to be hateful after kids, how to actually be a decent partner, as I should say my own husband absolutely is. I know it's possible because I live that reality of being in a marriage with a man, having a young child, and him absolutely doing 50% at least of the child rearing and domestic labor. That is, it's possible, and it should be a consistent reality, and that is going to require men to think carefully about whether they are acting overly entitled to things which everyone should have equitably, like leisure and sleep.
So would you say that the first kind of, your suggestion for the first step we might come to a more equitable society would be for people to realize what is at the root of many of the problems you talk about?
Absolutely.
And that would be the sense of entitlement, or not even sense of entitlement, but the entitlement that you do have reflection on your entitlement and what you can do to, I guess, give the same entitlement to somebody else. Would that be what you suggest?
And also to think about ways in which, as a girl or woman, you're genuinely entitled to things that you might feel guilty for claiming or might be denying yourself, like sleep and leisure, out of a false sense that you're not entitled to those goods on par with your male partner. So yeah, I think often in terms of these issues, of a wonderful quote by James Baldwin that I'll just paraphrase, which is that not everything that's faced can be changed, but nothing that's not faced can be changed. So in other words, facing up to reality is a necessary, though far from sufficient, step towards changing it. And really the goal of this work is to try, in as much as I'm able to do this, to illuminate some of the ways in which we do have this vastly uneven system of male entitlements on the one hand and lack of female entitlements on the other hand, as well as a false system of obligations that tell girls and women that they owe things to boys and men that in fact we don't. And to reduce both some of the external misogynistic punishment that women go through for not giving men what they're deemed entitled to, and also some of the guilt, the internalized shame and self-disgust and guilt that women feel for not executing their pseudo obligations to cater to boys and men in these ways that we're effectively taught to do.
Wonderful. On that note, I'd like to thank you, Kate, for this wonderful conversation and for taking the time to share this very insightful work and answer all of our questions. So since this is not, I'm imagining a live audience, and I would assume this would be where we would clap, but I would say we just have to have me say thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Carla, for a wonderful conversation, and everyone who has been here. Thank you.
So I will close up this webinar session to just say that the recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from Watch Again section of the festival website after June 20th. You will be contacted by email when the video is available to view. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Kate's book, Entitled, will be available from our partners booksellers, Fox Lane Books. For more information on the book sale, please see the festival website or head directly to foxlanebooks.co.uk. And we very much hope that you will continue to be engaged with York Festival of Ideas, who's celebrating their 10th anniversary this year. Check out the website yorkfestivalofideas.com for full details of all events in the festival program. We'd love to hear your thoughts on these events and continue the conversation using the hashtag #YorkIdeas. Everyone have a pleasant evening, and thank you for attending the webinar.